I'm John Marion from Common Cause Rhode Island. Really glad you joined us tonight for the first of our series of programs we call Demystifying Democracy. We're going to be revealing some additional topics and dates for future events very soon. So if you have an idea for an additional topic, feel free to put it in the chat or send us an email at Common Cause because we're always looking for ideas for this program. So we're going to use the chat tonight to share some resources that really are complementary to what we're trying to talk about tonight. The first one is an advocacy toolkit we made that includes a glossary of some of the terminology you're going to hear tonight, the timeline and description of the legislative process, some help with the legislative website and how to track bills, and even a map of the State House that you can use if you go there to find committee rooms and things like that. So that's at demystifyingdemocracy.org. We also will put this video up with all the other videos that we keep at that website. So if you want to see some of the other topics we've covered, you can go to demystifyingdemocracy.org. We'll put this video up tomorrow. So finally, I want to thank Sam Ogundari, who you can see up here on the screen as the star, for helping plan and execute tonight's event, and the June Rockwell Levy Foundation for its financial support for this event. We need to keep Common Cause a healthy organization financially, so if you're not a member and would like to join, we'll have a link in the chat for how you can do that. So now on to our program. We have four distinguished panelists tonight who have different perspectives on the legislative process in Rhode Island. The first I want to introduce is Representative Josh Giraldo. He's a representative for District 56. Josh is the former chief of staff for the city of Central Falls and a former teacher at Blackstone Valley Prep Memorial Mayoral Academy. He's a member of the House Education Committee, the House Health and Human Services Committee, House Small Business Committee, and House Special Legislation Committee. Next, we have Senator Bridget Valverde. She is a Rhode Island Senator for District 35. She earned a bachelor's degree from GW University in 2004 and is the former vice chairwoman of the Rhode Island Democratic Party Women's Caucus. She's now the vice chairwoman of the Senate Committee on Health and Human Services and a member of the Senate Committee on Environment and Agriculture. Next, we have Patrick Anderson, who's a State House reporter for the Providence Journal. Prior to working for the Providence Journal, he wrote for Providence Business News. He's been a frequent guest on Rhode Island PBS's A Lively Experiment, which I think he was on just last week, and the Bartholomew Town podcast, among other places you might have seen him. And finally, we have Kelly Nevins, who's Chief Executive Officer for the Women's Fund of Rhode Island. She's been a leader in the Rhode Island nonprofit sector since 1990 with expertise in strategic development, workplace equity and community relations, program development, and more. She serves on the Providence Mayor's Equal Pay Task Force and is vice chair for the Rhode Island Coalition for Reproductive Freedom, serves on the boards of the United Way of Rhode Island's Community Advisory Board, Grantmakers Council of Rhode Island, and Women's Funding Network. We're going to skip right into some questions for the panelists that I've prepared. If you have questions that you would like to ask, please use the chat feature to try to do those. And if we'll try to get in as many questions as we can tonight from the audience. And as time allows, we'll do as many of those at the end, but if there's some in the middle that I can field and throw to the panelists, we'll do that. So I'm going to start with Representative Giraldo and ask you just at a very basic level, not that song from Schoolhouse Rock, but sort of what's the basics of the General Assembly for those who aren't familiar with our state legislature?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me start by just saying how appreciative I am of being, for having been invited to participate tonight. Thank you to John, Sam, the donors, and everyone who's listening today. And we just appreciate being here and happy to have you joining us. So the overall basics are that we are a bicameral body, which means we have two legislative chambers consisting of the House of Representatives, in which I'm a part of, which has a total of 75 representatives, and we have the Senate, which has a total of 38 elected senators. In a very general sense, we meet for a few months each year with the goal of serving our constituents and improving the lives of Rhode Islanders through passing laws, passing resolutions, passing a budget. And we are part-time legislators. Most of us work far beyond, even though most of us work far beyond those part-time hours, in addition to our full-time careers at the State House while session is in. At the State House while session is in. We serve 2-year terms, and it is an honor to serve the residents that put their faith in us.
Thanks. Can I ask a quick follow-up, which is, and people might not be familiar, when you say part-time, like how much are you paid to be a state legislator?
We are paid $16,000 a year for the, just for the, as a salary for the year.
Okay, thanks. So Senator Valverde, so we heard sort of about bicameralism and the size of the chambers, but as the title of the program suggests, we're talking about sort of how bills become laws in Rhode Island. Can you just explain in broad outlines, kind of the flow of a piece of legislation through that process?
Sure. So I also like to say it's great to be here. And as a legislator who spent a lot of time in the State House as a kind of a citizen activist, testifying on legislation for years before I was elected to the General Assembly, I love that there are organizations like Common Cause who are helping other people to get involved in the process and demystify how things actually work there. The legislative process is we have senators and representatives, we develop legislation, and we actually get a paper bill, and we then gather co-sponsors, other like-minded legislators who might like to support that legislation as well. And then the bill is introduced, and it is assigned to one of the, well, in my case, a Senate committee that usually by topic, so dealing with similar bills. And then it will be assigned a hearing date. And we take testimony during that hearing from the public, from experts, and really kind of learn more about the bill, what it's trying to accomplish, and see if there are changes that need to be made. From there, the bill can either be held if changes need to be made, and then can be brought back to another hearing at a later date. It can be voted out of committee and sent to the floor for the full Senate or House to vote on. And although I guess it could potentially be killed in committee with a no vote, but although I have never witnessed that myself as a legislator, things are generally brought up for a vote when they have the votes to pass. And so from there, after if a bill passes the full Senate or House, it is then sent to the opposite chamber. So if we pass in the Senate, it'll be sent over to the House for the House to vote on. And then from there, if it makes it through both chambers, it will go to the governor for a signature. And then it becomes law. Like in the song, just like in the song. Yes. I guess the governor also has the chance to then veto a bill. And then the General Assembly can also have a chance to undo that veto.
No, thanks. That's a great overview in a very short period of time. So we're going to put in the chat some resources that I think do a good job of explaining some of what you just heard. So the Secretary of State has actually just recently come out with her own toolkit about how to get involved in the legislative process. And so the first link is going to be just to the general toolkit, which is about testifying. And the second link is one that her office finished today. And it's actually an infographic, like a flow chart of a piece of legislation and how it flows through the process as the senator just explained. So that's the next link. And finally, she came up with something I'm super jealous of, which is she took a bill and her team annotated it so that you can see all the different parts when you're looking at a bill and understand all the different parts. So we're not going to go through all that tonight, but those are things that you can grab in the chat, and we'll send you a follow-up email after the event, probably tomorrow, with all of these links. But they're really, rich ways to sort of understand some of the technical things about the General Assembly. So I'm going to go back to Representative Giraldo. We heard a little bit about the committees and the different options from Senator Valverde. And I'll put you on the spot a little bit, but she said that, she hasn't seen something voted down. Is that been your experience? And sort of like, I think there's held for further study. People don't really understand what that term means. In some, can you explain really what that's about?
Yeah, I'd be happy to explain. First off, my experience is similar to Senator Valverde's, in which most of the time when a bill has come to the floor, it's been worked on enough where there's probably going to be consensus. But the role of the committee process itself is meant to serve as sort of the first round of vetting for bills and pieces of legislation. There's thousands of bills that get submitted each and every year, and it would be almost impossible for the entire body, whether it's in the House or Senate, to debate each and every one of them. Therefore, we establish committees to help us with that process. In the House, we have more than 15 different committees, including committees on education, finance, veterans affairs, municipal government, and housing, for example. And I know that the Senate has almost a dozen that cover similar areas and are generally more inclusive. Any bill that a legislator wants to submit must first be assigned to a committee, which is determined by the relevant topic that the bill covers. So a bill focused on schools would likely go through education. A bill focused on veteran services would likely go through Veterans Affairs. A bill that impacts the budget would go through finance. These committees are generally comprised, at least on the House side, of about 10 to 15 members. The members have likely expressed at some point interest in those committees, as I did when I had requested early on to be on education and health and human services, as those are my passion. And I'm able to enter those conversations with a good amount of experience. Committees receive bills and first post them for a public hearing, in which the bill sponsor will usually show up and testify in favor of their bill and answer any questions of the committee members. There's also a time when advocates, the public, supporters, those in opposition get an opportunity to speak on the bill. Sometimes there's very little testimony. Other times we have some controversial bills that motivate hundreds of people to come out and testify. And we end up listening and staying beyond midnight. At the start of each committee meeting, we usually vote to hold all the bills for further study, which to me means we agree to hold off on voting on a bill until likely a later point in time in which it could be brought forward for consideration. Our committee meetings are usually posted on Fridays, but bills could be posted, I believe, up to 48 hours in advance, which doesn't leave us a ton of time for research. By holding bills for further study, we have the public hearing in which we can hear from all types of different people and groups. We hear the pros and cons from all sides. And rather than having to make a spot-on vote, we're able to do a few things with this process. One is we have the time to look into any of the claims, any of the attestations, the accusations, the data points, the surveys, et cetera, that are made or presented to us at the hearing, and we're able to do our due diligence and follow up on those. next, we can use some of that time to take what we've learned and consult with our constituents. Sometimes I hear something in a committee meeting and it makes me curious. So I go back to my mayor, I'll go back to my superintendent, I'll go back to someone that I know in my community that works in the field that the bill is related to, and ask them for their perspective. Especially since we're often learning new things and hearing viewpoints that, quite frankly, we sometimes didn't expect. It also allows us to prepare and recommend thoughtful amendments, and allows for, in many cases, I've been able to see two opposing groups have the time to be able to come together and find sort of at the sponsor's request, to come together and find sort of a middle ground on a specific approach. And for me, quite frankly, as an introvert and someone who's still somewhat a new legislator, I do appreciate being able to reflect on the multiple arguments that are all coming forward on a specific topic that I've heard, and then be able to advocate for the bills that I really like and I think should be explored further.
Thanks. It sounds like you have a constituent calling in the background. So
I do. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's great. So Senator, I was going to ask you about the timeline, but first, something people might have heard of is they refer to major committees and minor committees. Could you explain that differentiation a little bit?
We don't really use that differentiation in the Senate. I mean, I suppose the committees that generally meet twice a week, I guess could be considered the major committees. They have a lot of a big inventory of bills that they have to hear. So finance, health and human services, what else? And judiciary, and then I guess the minor ones would be considered more like environment and agriculture, education. Some of those on the Senate, those are the ones that we have on the Senate side.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess that's more of a House term now that I think of it. But yeah, there are committees that have sort of broader jurisdictions or larger inventories of bills that tend to meet more frequently. And then in terms of timeline, so you start when, end when, why are we doing this on a Wednesday night in February? And you're not up there at the legislature?
Sure. So as the representative mentioned earlier, we are a part-time legislature. So we are generally in session from the beginning of January through the end of June. We meet also generally, things have changed a lot during COVID, but generally we meet 3 nights a week. So Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And we meet starting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, where we have a floor session, which means that both bodies, they meet in their respective chambers and take care of any business that we have. And then we, from there, break and go to our various committees. In terms of the timeline of the entire session from January to June, the beginning of the session is really dedicated to developing legislation, introducing bills, and that's usually about the first 6, 7, 8 weeks of the session. And then we have a 1-week break in February where we don't meet, which is what we are in right now. That gives the General Assembly staff time to kind of catch up on all of the bills that have been introduced and get ready for what's coming next, which is when we come back next week, we will really dive into our committee hearing. So all of the bills that have been introduced will get a hearing, and then during that whole process, the budget articles, so the budget that the governor has submitted, is also being heard. And then the last thing, one of the last things that we do before we break for the summer is pass the budget. And that happens last because, first of all, it takes a long time for both chambers to agree on the budget, but Any bills that have passed that would affect the budget need to be incorporated into the final budget document. But we have to pass it theoretically before the end of June, because the fiscal year starts, the new fiscal year for Rhode Island starts on July 1.
Great, thank you. You condensed a lot of time there. So I see we got our first question in the chat, and thank you. And so I encourage people to continue to put questions in there. Kelly, thanks for your patience. You're an advocate. We're seeing questions about advocacy in the chat. You know, how do you, on behalf of the Women's Fund, sort of from the consumer side of this, how do you look for bills? How do you track bills and keep track of all this process?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, at the Women's Fund, we often talk about the bills that we would like to see passed, and some of them are ones that have gone through our General Assembly in the past and perhaps never moved forward. Some of them are new. This year, for example, I worked with a House and Senate sponsor on a brand new bill that's being brought to the various committees for hearing and hopefully to the floor for a vote. So sometimes it just starts with discussion about what we would like to see happen. I've just posted in the chat a tool that we sometimes use nationally to look at bills that might do some of the work that we would like to see happen in Rhode Island. And so it's a good tool. It is a progressive database of laws across the country. So just know that if you're somebody who's more conservative, you might not see the kinds of things that you're looking for in that database, but it could be a good tool. We also work in partnership with lots of coalitions, and so we're often moving coalition priorities forward, and together, again, identifying the priorities for each of those coalitions and what we would work on. Once a bill has been identified, you certainly can look at the state General Assembly website, which again, I will post in the chat box here, where you can read, different bill language, see what's up, and the state itself allows you to track different pieces of legislation. I'm not a fan of the state website to track legislation. Seems really clunky. So I use something called legiscan.com, which is a free tool that you can use keywords to search for different pieces of legislation, either here in Rhode Island or nationally, to see all laws that have something to do with feminine hygiene products, that kind of thing. And through a tool like Legiscan, there are other tools that are out there in the world. I saw one this week called Advocacy Hub, Rhode Island Advocacy Hub, that charges. So it's not a free tool, but it's also one that can alert you when different things come up. Legiscan will automatically notify me if there's a hearing that's coming up on the bills that I have listed for it to track in. If you go to the state website, as I've noted, not only can you read the language of the bills, but you can see, what's on the calendars for each of the different houses. You can see when votes are coming up. If you look at the calendars on Friday and general information, you can learn about what potentially is coming up in the next week. And that could help you to prioritize whatever written or verbal testimony that you would like to make towards a particular bill that is being heard. So there's a lot. I'm happy to take questions offline later. Hopefully I've answered the general gist of the question.
Yeah, let me ask you what that term calendar means, because I think we're all used to that term, but what do you mean when you say calendar?
Yeah, sure. So at that link for rhodeislandlegislature.gov, you can click on something that says House and Senate calendars, and it will show you, the previous calendars, if there are upcoming calendars that are posted, meaning this committee is meeting on this day, And these are the bills, the bill numbers that are going to be heard in those committees. So you can get a sense of what's going to happen. I think Representative Giraldo noted that, unfortunately, it's 48 hours notice often. And so you need to be paying attention to it. And that's why a tool like, for example, Legiscan or whatever you use might be useful, because it pushes stuff out to you rather than you necessarily having to go to the website and find it yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would also recommend, if you have a particular substantive interest, find the groups that are working in that area, and oftentimes they provide updates on their website, or they have lists of bills that they're tracking, and that can be a shortcut because there are thousands of pieces of legislation. So if you're interested, in privacy issues, go to the ACLU website, and they're going to tell you what bills on privacy are up. They're following that year. So Patrick, we're halfway through this. Thank you for your patience. We're seeing in the chat, and also, I have a question for you that's related, which is how the public can observe, right? And so we're in the middle of COVID still. In pre-COVID times, there was one type of observation, and now in COVID, things are very different. So can you kind of explain, as a member of the working press, what can you observe? What can the public observe? Are they the same thing at this point? And so forth.
Yeah, well, I can barely remember 2019, but to the extent that I do, it's not that different right now, especially right now as we're heading into March. Things have returned almost to normal. The House has said it's going to reopen its gallery when it comes back. The Senate gallery has allegedly been open the entire time. It's just not a single person has been going up there that I've seen, but that might just be people thought that it was closed. They've said it's been open. So you can, and the State House is open. You can enter it and come and, especially now that the House gallery is open, you will be able to watch both the House and the Senate, and you can watch House committees. They have been hybrid, in person, and partially remote. But people have been allowed in the House committees. The Senate committees have been all remote, all by telephone. And they said this week that they're considering that they want to go back to having in-person testimony. They're considering it, they're thinking about it, but we don't know when that's going to happen yet. So other than the Senate committees, you can come and participate mostly as you would before. There are lobbyists back in the building again, even though it's a fraction of the normal volume. And there seem like there are more restrictions on access to the floor of both chambers before the sessions, which traditionally is the major lobbying time, schmoozing time. That has really been curtailed by the pandemic. And the building is just much quieter. There are fewer events. They don't have people advocacy groups setting up tables, handing out snacks and buttons and pins. And there's usually a kind of little bit of a circus atmosphere when it gets going, and that's not there. But the basics are still there. I think what's really changed is partially that everyone now is doing more of everything online, and everything. There is the good news of the pandemic is there is more remote access to the General Assembly than there was before the pandemic. So that makes it easier for people to follow what's going on and to participate. But it might mean that fewer people are actually going to the State House and turning out. because they've gotten used to watching everything online. And that is also true of the press. I'm there most weeks in person and most session days in the building. But as more stuff returns online, it's always a question of whether you go to something in person or you follow it from your computer, where in truth, you can multitask, you can do 5 things, you can look everything up. And I think as folks have kind of mentioned, a lot of actually following the process and following the legislative debate happens on the computer anyway. When we are sitting on the House or Senate floor at the end of a session and they're actually passing dozens and dozens of bills, sometimes you won't even look up from your computer screen for 10 minutes at a time, because you're tracking all of the bills as they list off and as the votes are called. And so everything happens online a lot anyway. And so we just operate more virtually, like we kind of are in all aspects of life.
So you made a really great point. I forgot, because 2019 feels so long ago, but it used to be that there were committee hearings that weren't televised.
And some not even audio. This has dragged the Senate kicking and screaming to televise their committee hearings. And the House, even the ones that weren't televised, were at least being audio recorded and you could listen to a recording afterward. The Senate refused to do that for years, with little explanation, other than that they don't control the business arm of the legislature and they don't have as many resources. But so now they're doing that, which is a good thing.
No, I had forgotten that. So thank you for bringing that up. And it's an interesting perspective that even when you're physically there, sometimes you're glued to the computer nonetheless. So we're getting some questions in the chat that are touching on subjects that people are talking about. So I'm going to try to kind of weave them in to the questions. But for instance, a question about seeing written testimony. And as Patrick just pointed out, right, there are differences between the chambers. So the House, I believe, does put all testimony that's submitted to committees online, but the Senate hasn't been doing that. But you can request from the clerk. So if you ever want to see testimony, it's as simple. I would prefer, as an open government advocate, that both chambers post it online. It's fairly new that the House has been doing that, just in the last 2 years. But you go to the agenda for a committee, and there will be the email address or phone number for the clerk of the committee. If you call or email them, they will send you usually the testimony that was submitted for that bill. So that's a little shortcut if you want to see how people testified in the Senate. The House, since the pandemic, has been putting things online. Kelly, we got a question. How do lobbyists work? And you and I are lobbyists.
Yeah, so that's true. Right.
We tend to call ourselves advocates, but we're lobbyists.
Yes.
So,
and lobbyists are folks who spend a regular amount of time that actually doesn't have a definition in terms of hours, at this connecting with our General Assembly members about a variety of issues that are important to our organizations. So although I'm the CEO of the Women's Fund of Rhode Island and I do lots of jobs, I'm also, I guess, a paid lobbyist, because part of my work includes going to the State House or just talking with legislators about bills that are important to our organization. And I do that more than just 2 or 3 times a year. I do that regularly through the legislative session. As a lobbyist, people have asked, well, how do I get in touch with my legislator, or people in general? And again, I would just direct you back to the state's website, where you can learn about your specific representative and senator. Also, the Secretary of State's website will have that information, and will connect you directly to their information page. But you can potentially get their email address or their phone number and call them up. They want to hear from you. We hired these people, whether we voted or not. Ultimately, they were hired by the Rhode Island voting public, and so they work for us, and it's important that they hear from us. And so often I'm on the phone with a particular legislator about maybe a bill I want them to sponsor, or to go over the particulars of something, why I think they may be barking up the wrong tree, or something along those lines. Often we're meeting those legislators at the State House, so face to face, and this gives them an opportunity to have a real conversation with you. Sometimes it's right before they open up for their session, so maybe it's just a quick hello, and I'm going to give you a call or send you an email on something. Other times we have lengthy meetings, if we're able to schedule them, to talk in detail about a particular bill that we would like to see passed or not passed for any particular reason. And I've also had the pleasure of negotiating in various chambers the language of the bill, sitting on opposite sides of the table, from other folks who aren't happy with the language that we put forward, and really trying to come to that mid circle, if you will, to come to something that could be potentially a win-win for everyone. And legislators have been in those meetings and asking great questions. Again, they want to hear from us, so don't be afraid to reach out to them.
Thanks. And I'll just add, and as lobbyists is generally people who get paid to advocate. So if you're not paid, you don't necessarily have to register as a lobbyist. But our obligation under the law that's administered by the Secretary of State is we have to file reports. So if you go to the Secretary of State's website, you can actually find out how much folks are getting paid to lobby the legislature. And then Patrick gets to write great articles a couple times a year summarizing how much people are getting paid to lobby the legislature. So I'm going to try to synthesize a couple of questions we got in the chat, which is, whenever we have this, I think this is really a key question people have, which is, why do some bills get out of committee and why do some bills never get a vote? And there are examples we can give of bills that there was a bill about the straight party lever that hadn't had a vote. It had been introduced when John Kennedy was president, and every year thereafter, and didn't get a vote, I think, until 2014. And then there are other bills that seem to get votes in their first year. And I'm going to ask the legislators if they could try to explain, why, from your perspective, bills that ultimately succeed, how they manage to get a vote. And the flip side of that is like, what can people do, advocates do, groups do to try to encourage that?
I'll go ahead.
Thank you.
So there are definitely bills that can linger for years without getting a vote, even when they have majority support. Oftentimes, I think leadership does not like to bring bills for a vote that might be, politically bad for some of its members, and don't want to put their members in the position of having to vote for something. So for example, so the Reproductive Privacy Act that passed in 2019 after a years long fight, which that was a bill that codified Roe v. Wade into our state law, which, as we know, is becoming more and more important. There were a lot of advocates, a lot of legislators who were really pushing that bill very hard in both chambers. And eventually, I think that it became too hard for leadership in both chambers to not bring it to a vote, knowing that it had majority public support and majority support amongst their members, even though there were a lot of legislators who did not want to see it passed and did not want to have to take a vote on it either way. And so I think that goes to show just how important public involvement is with legislation and getting it to a vote. In the weeks and months leading up to that vote, the State House was filled with advocates every single day, having meetings with their legislators, holding signs, wearing T-shirts in support of the bill, you name it, making a lot of noise, and making it so that they just could not be ignored any longer. So that's one of the ways that a bill like that can finally get a vote. People want the noise in the building to stop. So I would encourage anyone, if there's something that they're very passionate about, to get up to the State House and tell people how you feel.
Yeah, it ultimately. So I think there's a little bit of a black box element to the decision making about when the committee, and if the committee has a vote, and that black box is difficult to describe to folks. But I saw Kelly nodding her head, sort of that advocacy can sort of push things in the right direction. To getting a vote, even though we don't necessarily know how we affected that black box, so to speak.
As a legislator who is not in leadership, it is a black box to me often, as to like when certain things are going to get a vote and why certain things get a vote and other things don't. And it's something that I do wish that we had more visibility on, both for the public and for legislators like myself.
So I'm grabbing an interesting question in the chat, which was describe the role of commissions. And I assume that the questioner is asking about study commissions. There seem to be like a lot more very active study commissions now than I've seen in the past. And I don't know if Patrick, you have any observations about sort of like, I know you've been watching some of these study commissions. We used to talk about study commissions kind of jokingly as where bills, it's the reward for your bill's going to get killed as you get a study commission. But there seem to be a lot of study commissions, particularly about things like the CRMC and shoreline access. And from your perspective, is there like, what are these and have they been valuable?
I think there are two general kinds of study commissions to characterize them. And one is generally one that's created to let the sponsors of legislation that is going nowhere feel like they're doing something and maybe kind of work out some of their frustrations in a study commission that won't go anywhere, but lets them get that energy out. And then a second kind of study commission that is used by leadership to justify before the fact legislation that is coming. And you're seeing more of the latter. Like there are, I think, two of the ones that are pretty prominent this year relate to housing. And you're going to see a package soon coming from the House related to housing. And the work that's being done, the testimony a lot of the findings that are happening in the study commission, I think, are preparing the field for the leadership backed legislation that's going to appear. And you've seen that with various things in the past. So it's not it's not a cut or dry thing, and there are commissions that are in the middle that don't fall into those categories, but that's kind of one way to look at them.
Thanks. I'm going to ask Representative Giraldo to sort of combine two things here. So those study commissions, who staffs those, and like, what does your staff look like, or lack thereof? Because I think people have a congressional model in their heads and they don't realize what the state legislature looks like on the inside in terms of staffing. So who staffs those study commissions, and like, who staffs you as a legislator?
Well, I'll start off with who staffs me. I was provided with a driver, 2 security guards. No, I'm just kidding. Completely kidding. We have shared staff. So for example, I have someone who can help me with press releases, a communications person that's shared between me and probably 6, 7 other reps. I have a contact in legislative services that helps me write the bill. So I come up with the ideas, or a bill that I've seen in another state, bring it to them, and they help me think through the process and come up with a draft bill. An administrative assistant that helps with like printing things, scheduling things, stuff like that. But all of those are shared positions, and actually each of them assists multiple representatives. And I know that some of them have other responsibilities at the State House. So it's not like their only job. They're wearing a few hats. And so in terms of who's staffing those legislative commissions, to be honest, I'm not quite sure, because I haven't had too much experience with any of the commissions yet. This is my first sort of full year. And so I don't have a ton of insight into that, unfortunately.
Yeah, Senator, I don't know if you have any insight into sort of, it's kind of a leading question. The point I'm trying to make is oftentimes the legislators themselves are kind of staffing themselves on those study commissions from what I've seen. Has that been your?
So there are, so obviously the legislators, they are the ones that sit on the commissions generally, but we have legal staff, and so different legal staff will be assigned to those commissions, as well as policy staff, who will be there to do research and kind of answer questions for legislators that they might have, usually kind of outside of the actual public facing commission work. And yeah, so it's generally the same staff that would staff a regular committee, will be pulled in depending on the topic of the commission.
And I'll point people in the chat, Representative Cortman, who thank you for joining us tonight, and talks a little bit about her experience as co-chair or chair of the Shoreline Access Study Commission and how that is staffed. So I want to, before I'll do a few more questions from the chat, but I want to kind of get at some very practical things for people who might be interested in going up there. I'm going to go back to Patrick and ask you the question that I've been doing this for 14 years, and my wife still doesn't know when I say, well, I have a meeting at the Rise. Like when somebody looks at an agenda and it says the meeting starts at the Rise, what does that mean? And like reasonably, how can they plan their evening to show up so that they're at a meeting that starts at a time that's not defined?
Well, they have to know to look at the calendar of the floor calendar of that day's House or Senate session. And then they should read the Providence Journal to see if any of the bills that are on that calendar are real talkers and are likely to get people hot and bothered. So basically, the Rise is the end of the the House or Senate session, and that depends on how long it takes. And if it's in the early days of the session, when there's not that much going on, that's usually around 5 o'clock-ish. But if we're talking the end of the session and something big is on the agenda, it'll be well into the night before there's a committee hearing, and sometimes you can't believe that they're actually going to do a committee hearing after the debate that just went on the floor, but they will. So there is no, you have to really gauge it based on what's going on the floor.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's as best a description as I can come up with as I try to explain if I'll be home for dinner. So Kelly, like you as an advocate, then you're waiting for the rise to go testify. Like very practically, sort of two questions. Like one is, do the bills get taken in the order you see them on that agenda? And two, when you testify, like, you just walk us briefly through the steps you need to do to kind of prepare and then deliver testimony.
Sure. And just seeing Cynthia's text in the chat, it's at the RISE, RISE. So when everybody, think of it as when everybody rises and moves on. Yes, there you go. In terms of, putting your name in to testify, pre-COVID, you would go up to the State House and you'd fill out a form. There'd be a clipboard and you'd put your name on the clipboard and say, I want to testify in support of or in opposition to a particular bill. I don't know if that will come back, but the current process that's in place is you would look at the committees that are being heard. And so if there is a House Education Committee that is going to be hearing a particular bill that you are interested in on Tuesday, you need to, on Monday, look at what's on their docket, all the different bills that are being heard, and you basically download a sheet of all the bills that are being heard by that particular committee on that day. And it has instructions at the bottom of how you can put your name on a list to either verbally or provide written testimony. And you don't necessarily right now have to go to the State House to verbally testify. When you fill out your form to verbally testify, they also can take your number and give you a call at the time that it's appropriate for you to give testimony if you're doing it verbally. A lot of people, some people still go to the State House and they wait until their bill comes up and they're called. But I do feel like the current process of calling people when their time comes up makes things a lot more accessible. I personally hope that doesn't go away. But having said that, right now, your process is you fill out a form to verbally testify, or you email your written testimony as per the instructions on the list of the bills that are being heard. It gives you all that information at the bottom of that sheet.
Yeah, can't emphasize enough to follow the instructions closely, because if you want to sign up to get that telephone call, I think it's 4 p.m. the day prior, and at 4:01 p.m. the day prior, that website stops taking, and I am guilty of having missed that deadline recently. So just make sure once you see that your bill is up for a hearing, that it's probably best right then to sign up and not put it up.
I'd also really quickly note, John, I'm sorry, Also, the written testimony, they're taking up to 3 hours now before the hearing. So if you just want to submit written testimony, you can email that. But if you want to advocate and you are working in partnership with a coalition or an organization that, again, is pushing a particular bill that you are interested in, you often can work with that organization to have them put your name in. Again, it takes some planning. So, if there's a really important bill that's coming up, like we're hoping to, help move the Equality and Abortion Coverage Act. And so there's lots of groups advocating on behalf of that bill. The folks who are leading that campaign are like, they're bringing together all their advocates now to say who's going to testify and what are you going to talk about in your piece of testimony versus this other person. So there's a lot of pre-planning that can go on for really important bills. And I would just note you'd want to partner with those organizations that are doing the things that you are hoping to push forward too.
Thanks. So we have like 2 minutes left, and there's one topic we haven't talked about. I think there's at least one question in the chat that relates to this. So I want to tease out just briefly, like amendments. So we haven't talked at all about a bill being changed at all during this process. So Senator, can you talk briefly about like when are bills amended in the process, and where can people find those changes?
Sure. So bills can be amended during two main parts of the process. They can be amended in committee. So when before a bill is voted out of committee, it can be what we call a sub-aid, or so it's substitute A. So basically a substitute language can be introduced on a bill that makes changes to the original legislation before it goes to the floor for a vote. If a bill makes it to the floor for a vote by the full chamber, floor amendments can be introduced. And so those will be amendments can be requested by any legislator. So if the legislator was not on the committee where the bill went through and they would like to have a crack at the bill and make a change, they can request an amendment to the bill. And then during the debate of the bill, they can say, I have an amendment to introduce, and we'll look it up on our, we have iPads on our desks in the chamber, and and then that amendment can be debated, and then the amendment is voted on and either wins passage or does not. And then we will proceed to vote on the bill as amended or the original bill if that amendment has failed. And people can look up the substitute bills through the regular search function on the legislation page on the General Assembly's website. It will be listed with the original bill, and so they can see what changes have been made.
Great, thank you. And there was a change a couple of years ago where those amendments in committee started to be posted 24 hours before they're voted on in committee. So this was actually pretty significant improvement to transparency that came, both the House and the Senate do this. So if there's going to be a substantive change to a bill in committee before the committee vote, they're required by their rules to post that change, the so-called sub-A, 24 hours before the vote on that sub-A. So that's just, I kind of want to lift up a little good transparency news there, but also kind of an inside way you can see what change is coming, which I think is valuable, both the advocates, the press, the public, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So we've reached our time. I saved the chat. There are some questions in the chat that didn't get answered. We'll see if we can reach out to folks and get you answers. As I said, we're going to post this on our website as soon as I can edit it tomorrow. And so I just want to thank the panelists. I thought that was excellent, great insights behind the legislative process. Although Patrick, I still can't tell people when I'm going to be home for dinner, nor can you. But I'm really grateful you took an evening, especially, you know, it's all sort of a quiet week for everybody in terms of the assembly. So to do this, and you know, emphasize this will be on demystifyingdemocracy.org, which is also where that toolkit is. You'll be getting a follow-up email with all the links we mentioned tonight. And please reach out. I'm putting my email in the chat. If you have ideas for future events, let us know. You know, and we will try to work with you to put together a program. So thank you for all the questions. Thanks to all the panelists for all the great answers. And I hope everybody has a good night.